She was 26 years old. She was a nurse. She was wearing a Red Cross armband, the universal symbol that says, "This person does not fight." And on February 16, 1942, on a beach in Indonesia, a Japanese machine gun opened fire and put a bullet through her back. That bullet passed clean through her left side, missed her spine, missed every organ that would have killed her. And because of that one impossible miss, what happened on that beach before the machine gun would stay buried for 77 years. Because her own government ordered her to never speak of it. They pulled pages out of official reports. They threatened a survivor into silence. They let war criminals walk free to protect themselves from a truth they were ashamed of. And the world didn't learn the full story until 2019. This is the story of Sister Vivian Bullwinkel, the Bangka Island Massacre. And the second crime, the one committed in silence, in classified files, by the country that was supposed to honour her. To understand what happened on that beach, you need to understand just how fast everything collapsed. February 1942. Singapore, the so-called Gibraltar of the East, the crown jewel of British imperial power in Asia, a fortress Churchill himself called impregnable. It was burning. Japan had torn through the Malay Peninsula in 70 days. 70. One of the most devastating military advances in modern history. British commanders had aimed their guns at the sea. The Japanese came through the jungle instead, and by February 12th, 130,000 Allied soldiers were surrendering. The single largest capitulation in British military history. The docks were chaos. Civilians were fleeing. The city was coming apart in real time. And somewhere inside that chaos, 65 Australian Army nurses from the 213th Australian General Hospital received a single order: evacuate. Now, these were not soldiers. These were nurses. Women who had volunteered for service, crossed an ocean, and spent months in Singapore keeping wounded men alive. And now they were being loaded onto the SS Vyner Brooke, a small, aging passenger vessel already dangerously overcrowded with civilians, wounded soldiers, women and children. Among them was Sister Vivian Bullwinkel, born December 18, 1915, in Kapunda, South Australia. Trained as a nurse in Broken Hill. Volunteered for the army in 1941, the same year Japan entered the war. By every account, exactly the kind of person you want beside you when everything falls apart. Calm, capable, focused. She boarded that ship with no idea what was coming. None of them did. The Vyner Brooke left Singapore on February 12, 1942. It got 2 days. Japanese bombers found the ship in the Bangka Strait. Direct hits, multiple. The vessel sank in minutes. 2 nurses died instantly in the attack. The rest, along with hundreds of passengers, were thrown into open ocean. No life rafts for most of them. No rescue. Just the South China Sea stretching in every direction, and wreckage sinking beneath their feet. Survivors clung to debris, to each other. Groups were scattered by the current across miles of dark water. Through the night, small clusters washed up on different parts of Bangka Island, a stretch of Indonesian coastline completely occupied by Japanese forces. Vivian Bullwinkel reached a beach called Radji Beach with 21 other nurses. A group of wounded Australian and British soldiers came ashore nearby. A handful of civilians. They were exhausted, injured, dehydrated. They had no food, no medicine, no weapons, no supplies of any kind. They made the only decision that seemed to make sense. Surrender. They were nurses, non-combatants. Their Red Cross armbands were still on their sleeves. The Geneva Convention was international law. Those emblems meant protection. That was the rule. That was supposed to be the rule. What they didn't know, what Allied commanders had deliberately kept from them, was that weeks earlier, when Japanese forces took Hong Kong in December 1941, they had raped and murdered British nurses there. Allied commanders had received those reports. They knew, and they still delayed the evacuation order for the Australian nurses in Singapore. That detail matters. Hold on to it. If you've never heard this story before, hit that like button right now and subscribe, because this is the kind of history that gets deliberately buried, and the only way it survives is if people keep talking about it. On February 16, 1942, a Japanese patrol arrived at Radji Beach. What happened next was not an accident. It was not one soldier losing control. It followed a pattern, a documented, deliberate pattern, already established in Hong Kong. Weeks before, the soldiers separated the men from the women. The wounded soldiers, men on stretchers, men who couldn't walk, were taken around a rocky headland out of sight. The nurses heard a machine gun. Then silence. Then the soldiers came back. They sat down in front of the women. They cleaned their bayonets. They cleaned their rifles. And then they did what the Australian government would spend the next 58 years making sure the world never knew about. Here's how we know what happened. Vivian Bullwinkel gave a private interview to Australian broadcaster Tess Lawrence before her death in 2000. She told her everything. We know because historian Lynette Silver later examined Bullwinkel's recovered nurse's uniform and found that the bodice had been ripped open, buttons torn off and resewn in mismatched thread. And the only way the bullet entry and exit holes physically aligned was if the uniform was open at the waist and down the front when she was shot. We know because a Japanese soldier gave an account to an Australian investigating officer in which he stated he had heard screaming on the beach and was told by a superior that the platoon was, his exact words, pleasuring themselves and that it would be his turn next. The 22 nurses were assaulted, all of them, before anything else happened on that beach, and when it was over, a Japanese officer gave an order: walk into the surf. Think about what that means. These women had survived the bombing of their ship. They had survived hours in the open ocean. They had survived the night on a beach on an occupied island. They had survived the assault, and now they were told to stand up, walk into the sea, and they did, in their uniforms, in a straight line, Red Cross armbands still on their sleeves. When the water reached their waists, the machine gun opened fire from behind. Vivian Bullwinkel was hit. The bullet tore through her left side and exited clean, missing her spine, her kidney, every organ that should have killed her if the angle had been 2 inches in any direction. She fell forward into the water and did not move. Around her, the sea turned red. Japanese soldiers waded through the bodies, bayoneting the wounded, making sure Vivian felt the water shift as they passed her. She did not breathe. She did not make a sound. For over an hour she lay face down in the surf among the bodies of women she had trained beside, sailed with, survived a sinking ship with. Then she crawled out, alone, wounded, on an occupied island, with nothing. In the jungle nearby she found Private Cecil Kingsley, a British soldier who had survived the massacre of the men. For 12 days she treated his wounds with her bare hands. No bandages, no medicine, nothing but her training. 12 days. When Kingsley became too sick to survive without real medical care, they decided together to surrender. Kingsley died shortly after. Vivian was sent to a prisoner of war camp on Sumatra. She spent the next 3.5 years there. And here's the detail that stops me every time. She couldn't tell anyone what she had witnessed. Not her captors, not the guards, because if the Japanese soldiers in that camp ever discovered she had survived Radji Beach, that she was a witness, they would have killed her on the spot. So for 3.5 years, she kept the massacre secret from the very people holding her prisoner. She said nothing. The nurses who survived on other parts of the island closed ranks around her. They made a pact. Those who live will remember everything. When the war ends, they will tell the world. The war ended. Vivian came home. In 1947, she stood before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East in Tokyo. This was the moment, the stage they had promised each other in that jungle camp. She testified about the massacre. She described the beach, the soldiers, the machine gun, her colleagues dying in the water around her. She did not mention what happened before the machine gun, because she had been ordered not to. While she was still serving in the Australian Army, military officials explicitly instructed her to remove those details from her war crimes deposition. The assault, the screaming, the evidence on the uniform, gone, buried, on orders. The government's stated reasoning tells you everything about 1940s attitudes toward women. Senior officers claimed they wanted to protect the families of the dead nurses from the stigma of rape. In that era, rape was considered shameful, not for the perpetrators, but for the victims. That was the cultural logic. But underneath that, there was something far darker. Those same Allied commanders had received intelligence from Hong Kong. They knew exactly what Japanese forces had done to British nurses there. They delayed pulling the Australian nurses out of Singapore anyway, If the full story of Radji Beach was ever told, if the world understood these women had been assaulted and then executed, and that Allied command had intelligence suggesting exactly this kind of atrocity was coming, the reckoning would have been enormous. Careers would have ended. Reputations would have collapsed. So they buried it instead. The perpetrators of the Bangka Island Massacre were never identified, never charged, never tried. The Australian government's official position to this day is that the perpetrators escaped punishment. That is a bureaucratic sentence, for we let them walk free and we made sure no one knew why. Here's what's extraordinary about Vivian Bullwinkel. She didn't disappear. She came home and built an entire life in the open. She became Director of Nursing at Fairfield Hospital in Melbourne. She sat on the Council of the Australian War Memorial. She raised funds for a nurses' memorial. In 1992, 50 years after Radji Beach, she returned to Bangka Island to unveil a shrine at the exact location where her colleagues died. She accepted every honour, every ceremony, always on behalf of the women who died. Never for herself. For 58 years, she carried what she knew, in public, smiling, receiving awards, standing at ceremonies, all while carrying a truth she had been ordered to never speak. But before she died in 2000, she sat down with broadcaster Tess Lawrence and told her everything. She asked Lawrence to make sure the truth came out. She was tortured by the secret, Lawrence said. She wanted to include it in her statement to the War Crimes Tribunal. She was ordered not to by her own government. It more than irked her. Vivian Bullwinkel died on July 3rd, 2000. She was 84 years old. She never saw the truth spoken publicly. In 2019, 77 years after Radji Beach, military historian Lynette Silver published her book, Angels of Mercy. For the first time in history, every surviving piece of evidence was assembled in one place. The private testimony Bullwinkel gave to Tess Lawrence, the forensic analysis of the uniform, the mismatched thread, the open bodice, the bullet holes that could only align one way, the Japanese soldier's account to the Australian investigating officer, a report written by the wife of an Australian Army investigator, several pages of which had been physically torn out by someone who had decided, decades earlier, that no one should ever be allowed to read them. It's taken a long while, Silver said, for enough bits of evidence to come together to enable us to say now, yes, this happened. It actually did happen. 77 years. 19 years after Vivian Bullwinkel died, still carrying the secret. There's one more detail that I think matters more than people realise. The bodies of the bayoneted soldiers, the men killed on that beach, were left where they fell. The bodies of the women were not. Someone in that Japanese chain of command knew what had been done, knew it was a crime even by the brutal standards of wartime, and made a deliberate decision to remove the evidence. It didn't work, because one bullet missed. The women who walked into that water on February 16, 1942, deserve to have their names spoken out loud. Matron Irene Drummond, Sister Elaine Balfour Ogilvie, Sister Mickey Farmaner, Sister Pat Gunther, Sister Blanche Hempstead, 21 women who had survived the bombing of their ship, who had held each other through the night in open ocean, who made a decision that should have been safe, that was supposed to be safe under international law, to surrender, who walked into the surf in formation in their uniforms, Red Cross armbands still on their sleeves. They were nurses until the last possible moment. They were not statistics. They were not footnotes. They were real women with real names, and they were failed twice, once by the Japanese soldiers on that beach, and once by the government that was supposed to honour them. Here's what this story is actually about. Rape has been used as a weapon of war for as long as there has been war, and the institutional response, from armies, from governments, from the men in charge, has almost always been identical. Silence, protect the institution, protect the image of victory, and ask the women who survived to carry the shame alone. Vivian Bullwinkel was ordered to do exactly that. She carried a truth that should have been spoken in a Tokyo courtroom in 1947, a truth that might have held someone accountable, might have changed something, completely alone. For 58 years. There is no justice at the end of this story. Not the kind you can point to. The perpetrators died free. Their commanding officer committed suicide before he could be interrogated. The soldiers were never identified. But there is truth. Finally, It took 3 women to say what one woman had been forbidden to say for most of her life. Tess Lawrence kept the promise. Lynette Silver kept digging. Barbara Angel examined every thread and bullet hole in that uniform until the evidence was impossible to deny. And in the end, even after her death, Vivian Bullwinkel made sure it got told. She survived a machine gun on a beach in Indonesia. She survived 3.5 years in a jungle prison camp. She survived 58 years of being ordered to keep the worst truth of her life locked inside her. And she still found a way to make sure the world eventually knew. History doesn't always give us justice, but sometimes, if one bullet misses and one woman refuses to let the truth die with her, it gives us something that matters just as much, the truth itself. If this story moved you, share it, because these names, Vivian Bullwinkel, Irene Drummond, Elaine Balfour Ogilvie, and every nurse on that beach, deserve to be remembered. Subscribe if you want to keep uncovering the history that powerful people decided the world wasn't allowed to know. And drop a comment below. What part of this story hit you hardest? The massacre itself, or the 58 years of government silence that followed? Because those are 2 very different crimes, and only one of them has ever been acknowledged.